Evil Dead Rise is the latest installment in the Evil Dead anthology, I guess you'd call it. Being the 5th film in the franchise, this one is noteworthy because it brings the series back to its original horror roots. Again. However, the sudden shift in tone shows a clear separation between two different aspects of the series. Horror versus comedy. So today I thought it's worth discussing just exactly how Evil Dead suffers from an identity crisis. Evil Dead is one of the most fascinating franchises to discuss because, in a lot of ways, the filmmaking itself can be more entertaining than what's on screen. Written and directed by Sam Raimi and starring his high school buddy Bruce Campbell, Evil Dead was showcasing their affinity for things like classic Universal horror. Being made on a micro-budget and an obscenely long shooting schedule, Evil Dead is unique that in a lot of ways its flaws can actually be appealing rather than a turnoff. The cheap look, unconvincing makeup, cheesy effects, and just outright continuity errors are what gives the movie its charm. Part of the fun of watching it is trying to figure out how they pulled off certain things. It didn't have the polish that Hollywood gives, it was just a bunch of amateurs making a movie together. And of course, its highly stylized direction is what separates it from the bunch. There are countless other horror movies that came out around this time which have been pretty much forgotten, whereas Evil Dead is still talked about. They might have had bigger budgets and better equipment, but they just don't leave you with a lasting impression. It's mainly due to how manufactured they were. They were more so cashing in on the horror trends of the time rather than making something that they were passionate about. Evil Dead, on the other hand, had plenty of personality behind it, so it doesn't feel quickly rushed out for the sake of it. It feels like there was some time and care put into it, with many of its faults coming down to budgetary restrictions and just general amateur filmmaking. Now, an unintended side effect of this is that those more limited elements seem almost comedic. Like how the goal of the scene is to scare you, but it doesn't quite hit the mark, so you laugh. This is most likely why the rest of the franchise took on a more comedic tone. Well, part of the reason. I also think Sam Raimi was willing to go that route because he's a huge slapstick comedy fan. Even the first film had clear Three Stooges influences. So 6 years after the original comes Evil Dead 2, a sort of quasi-remake of the first while also taking the story and world in a much different direction. Now, despite having studio backing and more experience, was this the route the series should have gone? Yes. With a big part of that solely just being Bruce Campbell. As much as I love the first film, one of the weakest aspects are its characters. None of them have really defined personalities, especially Ash. He doesn't really take charge or get a hold of the situation he's in. He's just kind of fumbling through it and accidentally survives by the end. Something that does shine through, however, is Campbell's physical acting. Maybe it's partly due to the low budget, but the stunts he has to go through are brutal, but he always seems willing to do them. While his vocal performance is wooden,
"You bastards! Why are you torturing me like this? Why?"
his physical performance is top-notch. So when they decided to go the more comedic route for the sequel, it's no surprise they played into the physical comedy. I make no exaggeration when I say this is Buster Keaton or Monty Python levels of physical comedy, and it was the perfect way to take the character. This Ash is much different from this Ash. Campbell has a fantastic speaking voice, which plays really well into his whole impromptu hero, full of himself persona.
Groovy.
All this being said shows that once again, this is not a cynically made cash grab of a franchise. Raimi and company cared about what they were putting into it. However, this also shows the level of interest that was in the series. The inherent problem is that the first Evil Dead, while it was a hit, wasn't some big moneymaker like A Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th. Both of those were big hits, and as a result had sequels churned out every year. The Evil Dead was more so a cult hit, which mainly was popular among drive-ins and midnight screenings. So when a sequel comes out with an X rating, the love doesn't spread as far and wide as they might have hoped. Despite having a modest budget, it vastly underperformed, causing the series to be once again laid to rest for a few years until Evil Dead 3 comes out 5 years later. Except instead it's just titled Army of Darkness. Because this one had a bigger scope and budget, they wanted to distance themselves from the original movies. While maintaining the comedic tone from the first movie, it has a completely different setting and feel. The main difference is how the levels of gore are brought down dramatically. This also shows how far they're able to take this concept. From a small cabin setting to a medieval one not only is original for this kind of series, but also leads to a lot more comedic scenarios. Now, did all of this help the film succeed financially where the others didn't? Yeah, what do you think? Once again, the film underperformed, barely even making its production budget back in its original run. But, like the other films, grew a massive cult following. The series lay dormant, however, while Raimi busied himself with other projects like the Spider-Man films. It wasn't until over 20 years later where they resurrect the series, with Raimi himself producing a straight-up remake of the original. This was done in the wake of all those Michael Bay horror remakes. Yeah, you remember them. But this one boasted to be what the original tried to be. It had tons of gore and a creepy atmosphere with basically no humor throughout. Well, except for the post-credits scene.
Groovy.
I love you, Bruce. And this actually proved to be a hit as the film grossed nearly $100 million on a modest $17 million budget. But did they move forward with this version of the franchise? Nope. The conversation around it died pretty quickly. Yeah, it made a lot of money, but horror movies have a tendency to, when marketed right. I think the problem is that there isn't much to talk about. Sure, it has a lot more gore and it was better shot than most horror movies of the time, but the characters or story wasn't anything to write home about. The original film had a lackluster story and bland characters, but as I said before, a big part of the appeal was its personality. Here, everything's just a bit too polished and standard. The book doesn't even have a face. Why? It's one of the most memorable aspects of the whole series. Fast forward a couple of years after that, and seemingly out of nowhere, Starz releases the TV series Ash vs. Evil Dead, a direct sequel show to the original trilogy. Now let me tell you, this is using Ash to his fullest potential. One of, if not its greatest strengths, is that it highlights just exactly what makes Ash so memorable. You can say all the one-liners and kill as many deadites in fun ways as you want, which, trust me, there's plenty of that. But it shows that Ash is basically some guy who accidentally keeps saving the world. He isn't a hero who trained to fight evil, he's a burnt-out loser past his prime who is the only one who really understands how to defeat evil, which makes him an egomaniac. It's glorious. The show is also elevated by its side characters like Pablo, who acts as a Jimmy Olsen type guy that looks up to Ash, and Kelly, who acts as a sort of straight man, and despite not really liking Ash, at least at first, sees that he's the only one who can save the world. Don't get me wrong, the show is fairly flawed, with logic being all over the place, mainly since the earlier films never got a grasp on it, and it has some pacing issues here and there. But it's still a fantastic show, which unfortunately, just like the previous films, didn't perform very well, which leads to a generally unsatisfying series finale, or lack thereof. But, just like the previous films, it gained a cult following and is still heavily streamed on Netflix. Now fast forward 5 years later, and just this year we got Evil Dead Rise. A new film once again with a serious tone, although not a remake like the original, more so a reboot. Now this film came across a bit odd to me when it was first released. It just seemed like a random approach to the series. But then it made a lot more sense when Bruce Campbell said if this first one does well, they want to make a new one every 2 or 3 years. And it did. Now the film itself overall is alright. The mostly one location setting was used effectively. However, it suffers from a lot of the same problems the 2013 film did. Yes, it has a lot of polish and the gore is effective, but I don't think it provides that much in terms of memorability aside from Alyssa Sutherland's performance as well as the ending, which I'll admit feels like something right out of the original films. So this brings us back to the split in the franchise. The horror versus the humor, or to put it a lot more bluntly, profitable versus memorable. I'm not trying to say the new film doesn't have some memorable aspects. The book, once again lacking a face, having teeth as a lock is a cool touch, and the whole bank vault aspect is a pretty neat idea. But aside from the shock value, I'm not really left with much outside of just the tone. Whereas the original are memorable in so many different ways, that doesn't really help them become elevated to wider audiences. I don't think people flock to theaters to see the latest installment in the Evil Dead franchise, they more so just wanted to see a standard horror movie. Which, and I hate to say this, is for the most part what this is. So if they want to go the route of making a new film every couple of years, that will kind of strip away the uniqueness of the franchise. The only thing I can hope for is if they go really out there with it being an anthology type series. Like do what Prey did and take the concept in a completely different direction. I would love to see an Evil Dead movie in ancient Egypt or during the Salem witch trials. Get directors with the right visions and they'd basically write themselves. Whereas the comedic side, I feel they've always been more experimental, probably to see what would actually make money. From changing genres to video games to TV shows, this side has always seemed much more eager to try different things, with Bruce Campbell saying he even wants to do an animated series at some point, which I am very much down for. In short, it's hard to think of a franchise that is this clearly defined of a tonal split. But in a way, I guess that could be seen as a good thing. It means that it can appeal to a much wider array of audiences. Evil Dead, there's something for everybody. But while I much prefer the comedic side, I can respect what they're going for horror-wise. I can only hope they actually do something different with the newer horror movies we'll most likely be getting. The last thing I'd like to see is the series go dormant completely. Not groovy.